Good afternoon. I'm Isobel Mackenzie, Seniors Advocate for the Province of British Columbia, and I am privileged to be speaking to you today from the land of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples of the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. Today, my office is releasing Billions More Reasons to Care. This is a follow-up report that examines how the money is being spent in the contracted long-term care sector in British Columbia, and we compare how it's being spent today to how it was spent 5 years ago, which we reviewed in a previous report. So just as a quick recap, in British Columbia, we have 28,000 publicly subsidized long-term care beds. And of those, we contract with the private sector through both not-for-profit societies and for-profit companies to supply about 65% of our overall subsidized long-term care beds in British Columbia. At $2 billion a year, the transfer from government to the private sector to deliver long-term care is actually one of the largest transfers that government undertakes on an annual basis. And the demographics tell us that we are going to need more long-term care services in the future, and we know that it is also costing more to provide the same level of care. And that's why it's very important for us to ensure that these contracted long-term care beds, which are the majority of our publicly subsidized beds in British Columbia, that the money being spent in these facilities is being done in a way that provides the best possible care for the residents who live there and good value for the public who is paying for it. This review has looked at the 2021-2022 financial reporting from each of the long-term care facilities in British Columbia, all of the contracted facilities. It's their information that they have provided to the health authorities. And we've compared it to what they provided in 17-18 to give us a sense of what has been happening over the last 5 years. Now, this report, like all other reports from my office, are the result of the work of many people. And I want to take this opportunity to thank my staff back at the Office of the Seniors Advocate. They are a small but mighty team. And also to thank the staff at the Ministry of Health and the health authorities who were instrumental in verifying data and providing us with some of our needed data, and to all of the long-term care facilities who provided the financial information that was required of them to their health authorities and through them to us. So first, let's just take a look at what's happened overall in long-term care in BC in the last 5 years. Well, first, we've had the COVID-19 pandemic, which consumed us for 2 years and revealed to many people in British Columbia and arguably across Canada what life was like in long-term care. And so it heightened our attention and made people more aware, and that is a good thing, because certainly while there were many, many tragedies in long-term care in the COVID-19 pandemic, coming out of those tragedies hopefully has been a path forward for how we will make things better for our seniors in the future. So we've had the COVID-19 pandemic. Over the last 5 years, there's been an incredible boost in funding to increase care levels in our care homes in BC. We've gone effectively, the numbers vary a little bit depending on which year and which month you're taking the measure in, but suffice it to say that we've gone from most of our care homes not meeting the provincial guideline of 3.36 average hours of care per resident per day to almost all of our facilities meeting it. And overall, the provincial average of care for residents in long-term care now is actually in excess of 3.36. So that's a good thing. Wage leveling. So one of the benefits of the COVID-19 pandemic was the recognition that not all of the care staff in our care homes were paid the same, effectively doing the same job and doing it for publicly subsidized beds. And so we implemented wage leveling across all job classifications. And that, I think, has stabilized the workforce to a large extent. and is reflected in our ability to deliver more care hours than we have in the past, so wage leveling. We also developed a standardized provincial template for financial reporting. This was in response to our last report. It hasn't been fully operationalized yet. It is not a decision-making tool. Health authorities aren't deciding their funding levels based on that provincial financial reporting template yet. But it has been developed, it is in place, and we're looking forward to seeing it fully implemented in the years ahead. And the province responded with the Health Career Access Program, HCAP, which has effectively recruited and trained and deployed thousands of new care aides into long-term care over the last 5 years. So that's sort of the context or the background of what's been happening over the last 5 years. Now, in terms of funding, let's take a look at what we found. So last year, we spent a total of $2.9 billion in long-term care across this province. That's a 45% increase over 5 years. Inflation over that same time frame ran at 15%. So we can see it's costing a lot more to deliver effectively the same amount of service to really the same number of people. So we're going to have to pay increasing attention to the amount of money in long-term care and where it's going. Of that $2.9 billion, 65% of it, or $1.9 billion, went to the contracted long-term care sector, to the private sector, both in the not-for-profit societies and the for-profit companies. And that represented a 35% increase over 5 years. So more of an increase in health authority sites than in contracted sites. Reasons for that vary, including the fact that health authorities are delivering care in very small sites throughout much of rural British Columbia, which is a very, very expensive model of care delivery. So in terms of funding, so if we look at over the last 5 years, how have we spent the money, the proportion of funding to the specific categories has not shifted dramatically from 17-18 to 21-22. It's really about the same. We're spending about 70% on our labor-related costs of direct care and indirect care staff compensation. We're spending about 12% on our buildings, that's mortgages and depreciation and those costs. About 12% on supplies and administration, so all of the masks and the gloves and the hygiene products and all of those kinds of things are in our supplies and administration, and about 4% on profit. But when we look at these individual categories and see how much they increased over the last 5 years, it's not uniform. So the bulk of the money is in labor, and when we look at what was the increase in direct care costs and non-direct care cost, staff compensation, it's about 33%, and that's the bulk of the money. When we look at capital costs, the buildings, what we're spending on our mortgages and our interest costs, it goes up about 18% over the last 5 years. So it's below our overall rate of increase. When we look at the cost of supplies, what we call supplies, administration, and other, dramatic increase, 61%. This is reflecting all of the supplies we had for COVID. So the masks, the gloves, the disinfecting products, all of these kinds of things, this would be captured in this category, and that's why we saw such a dramatic increase over the last 5 years. And a bit surprisingly, over the last 5 years, we saw a 113% increase in profit. Now, it's the smallest of the expenditure items in terms of dollar amounts, but dramatically it's the largest in terms of increase. And I say surprising because, you know, when we were looking at the pressures that long-term care is under and the cost pressures that they're under, it is a bit surprising that we saw that degree of increase. And I'm going to go into that a little bit more a little bit later. Now, this review found, similar to our last review, that there are very distinct patterns of spending depending on whether a care facility is a for-profit provider or a not-for-profit provider. And this is something that I think we have to pay greater attention to, and that we have to address more precisely in our funding formula. So if we look here, overall, you can see The big differences are basically not-for-profits are spending more on direct care, less on their buildings, and less on profit. Those are the biggest differences that you see between the two sectors. But it's very helpful to look at some of these on a per bed basis, because that sort of equalizes out, large facilities, small facilities. It sort of is a measured way of comparing apples to apples. So if we look at direct care staffing, so direct care staffing is nursing, care aides, so nursing is registered nurses, licensed practical nurses, care aides, allied health, so your physiotherapist, your occupational therapist, your speech therapist, social worker. It is not the cleaning staff, the food services staff. Those are what are called indirect care staff. They're a different category. So this is direct care staffing, expenditures per bed. And what you can see is that consistently over the last 5 years, the not-for-profit sector has spent more, 25% more in the last year, compared to the for-profit sector in what it's putting to direct care costs, even though they're receiving relatively the same amount of funding in terms of the care hours that they're delivering. And what this means, and this is part of explaining some of these differences that we're seeing. Why did the cost per hour work not change even though we had wage leveling? Well, because the not-for-profit sector is delivering many, many more care hours than the for-profit sector, even though they're effectively funded the same for them. So in 21-22, which is the period we've reviewed in this report, the not-for-profit sector delivered 93,000 care hours more than they were funded to deliver, and the for-profit sector delivered 500,000 hours less than they were funded to deliver. And if we look at what it was in 17-18, the numbers were a bit different, but the principle was the same, or the pattern was the same, which is the not-for-profits were delivering more, 80,000 more 5 years ago, and the for-profits were delivering less, 207,000 less hours than they were funded to provide. So it has a real impact on a day-to-day basis in our care homes. Now, arguably, it's a small percentage of the overall, 12 million care hours, if you will, but it's subtle. And I think, we have to recognize the subtlety of shaving off 5 minutes here and 5 minutes there. And then the next time we shave off another 5 minutes, but we're shaving it off of care hours that's where I think we've underappreciated the impact of this when you look at it on an individual facility basis. It's quite striking when you look at it overall, and it really does tell us that we've got some issues. Now, the other area where there's a big difference between the for-profit and the not-for-profit sector is around building expenses. And our last report went into this quite a bit and talked about this quite a bit, because effectively what you've got is a significant capitalizing of the not-for-profit sector. We're not paying not-for-profit operators what we should for their buildings, but we are paying the for-profit sector for their buildings. And remember that these are significant assets. They aren't assets that the government owns, but they are assets that the government has effectively paid for. We've paid for it through our per diems that pay mortgage costs and interest costs, and you'll see a demonstration of that in a couple of slides from now. And it really means, when you go into a subsidized long-term care home in British Columbia that is provided to you by your government, and we're taking 80% of your income, there shouldn't be a difference. You shouldn't be getting more care one place, less care another, older building here, newer building here, you've got to share a room here, you get your own room over here. It should be more equitable. We're getting there bit by bit on the care hours, but we still have quite a distance to go in terms of the physical environment and making that more equitable for the residents that live there. And then there's profit. So overall, last year, 74% of all of our contracted long-term care facilities made a profit. That's a little bit more than 5 years ago, but not dramatically more. And it sort of bounces a little bit each year when you look at it. It's not, but not dramatic. We haven't seen a dramatic shift in any of the years of the past 4 years. Proportionately, the for-profit facilities were making a little bit more of them were making a profit, but not dramatically more than the not-for-profits. What is dramatic, however, is when you look at the amount of profit. And 80% of the total profit is concentrated in 20% of our facilities. And that is very, very, very concerning. Almost all of them are for profit. So 80% of the total profit is concentrated in 20% of the facilities. So the issue isn't the overall 4% profit in the contracted long-term care sector. Arguably, that's quite reasonable, even small. The issue is the concentration of that profit in a very small group of our facilities. And so if you look at it on a per bed basis, the for-profit sector made 7 times the amount of profit per bed that the not-for-profit sector made. And that is very concerning and speaks to a funding formula that is not fair and equitable to all operators across the system. And here's an illustration. Now this is a bit, I have to look at the paper copy. I can't see it on the screen. It's so tiny. And it's elaborated a bit more in the report. And I would encourage people to look at this because it sort of, in a nutshell, sums it up. So what we have here are 2 care homes. One is not-for-profit, one is for-profit. These are their real financials. We've, of course, removed their names. They're about 150 beds each, and they're both 40 years old, which is important. So the total revenue, you can see the for-profit care home got a little bit more revenue than the not-for-profit care home. Look at the staffing cost differences. The not-for-profit has spent $12.9 million on staffing versus the for-profit, which has spent $8 million on staffing for effectively the same number of beds. And when you look at the details, a big part of that, wages is a part of that, but a big, big part of it is benefits. Effectively no benefits provided in the for-profit care home to any of the direct care or indirect care staff. Then look at the building expenses. So you've got the not-for-profit care home at 1.3 million building expenses and the for-profit at 2.8 million. Again, same size, same age. So you've got the not-for-profit's got its mortgage of $300,000, which it's charging the principal and interest, and we're paying that principal and interest. And then you've got the for-profit, which has remortgaged. It has a $2.4 million mortgage that we are paying the principal and interest on. And so what are they doing with the $2.4 million? They're not putting it back into care. They're not using it to, in this particular case, to refurbish. So the question is, why are we paying this principal and interest on this mortgage for this building that we don't own? And we're not doing it to the same degree for the not-for-profit. Other expenses, relatively, taxes and utilities, are arguably similar. Maintenance and repairs, a bit higher in the not-for-profit care home than in the for-profit care home. Replacement reserves, so the not-for-profit is putting a little more aside, $300,000 as you can see, less in the for-profit care home. Then we look at administration expenses. So you can see that the sort of what we call the office admin expenses similar between the two, audit and insurance, not that dissimilar. But then there's $340,000 charged for a management fee in the for-profit care home that we don't know who's getting that, what it's for. We only know it's not charged in the not-for-profit care home. And even after all of that, and they're spending about the same amount on supplies, you have in the not-for-profit care home a loss of $500,000, a little more than $500,000, And in the for-profit care home, you have a profit of $3.3 million after we've paid a $2.3 million mortgage principal and interest, and after we've paid a $342,000 management fee. So this is not the most dramatic example. It's not totally typical, but it illustrates the problem, which is the funding formula that's applied is the same, and this is the result from that funding formula, where we are rewarding, if you view profit as your reward, we are rewarding not spending on the care. That's where the big difference is. There is this whole, for want of a better term, dog's breakfast of building that we've got to sort out. And it's different in each health authority. How are we going to pay you for the use of your building? Right now, we're paying your costs, which is not a particularly good way to do it. We don't know if we're getting value for money. We don't know if we're paying market rates. We don't know, and these issues were raised in the previous report. So, in conclusion, when we did this, this is an update, this review. There hasn't really been much change over the last 5 years. Now, to be fair, the government has recognized the need for change. They have created a standardized financial reporting template. It was one of our recommendations last time. We're not making the funding decisions based on that yet. It's unclear when health authorities will begin to use that to determine how much each care home is going to get for the year. And they are working on a revision of the funding formula, but exactly when are we going to get to the application and implementation of a new funding formula is unclear. There's a phased approach or an incremental approach they're taking, and it isn't clear when, at the end of the day, we will see a new funding formula. The current system is not focused on maximizing resident care. It's not equitable to operators. So it's not, fair to the people living there that my facility is spending less on direct care, and it's not fair to the not-for-profit operators who aren't being adequately compensated, mostly for their buildings, and we are letting them provide a lot more care than we fund them, and we're letting the for-profits provide less care than we fund them for. And these issues will grow without fundamental reform. Incremental reform is not going to be sufficient here. It's going to have to be fundamental reform on funding contracted long-term care. And when we look at what lies ahead and how much more we're going to be spending, it went up 35% in 5 years with almost no growth in our beds. We're going to need more beds. It's going to go up more. And wage costs are going to continue to rise. And it's pretty clear to most of us that while BC was a leader in the 3.36, the goalposts have shifted, and now we're looking at 4 hours of care. So that's going to cost even more. So it's really important to get this funding system aligned to the incentives, and it is critical when we do that to recognize for-profit facilities perform differently than not-for-profit facilities, all things being equal. Every year, for 5 years of this, in fact 6 years, because the previous review looked at the year before, in every year, the patterns are pronounced. They are, and it is very, very clear that they will perform differently, all things being equal. And that's not a bad thing. We just need a funding formula that recognizes that harnesses what is good about the for-profit sector and turns it to incentivize it to provide the care that we need, and then to be fair to the not-for-profit sector in terms of equitable funding around its buildings. So we've issued 4 recommendations, which are 4 of the 5 we issued last report. One of the recommendations, the standardized reporting template, has been completed by the government. So, first recommendation, funding for care must be spent on care. You need a financial incentive to say to operators, we're giving you this money to spend on care. You must spend this money and all of this money on care. And only then will we compensate you. We can't allow this drift of being able to say, well, I didn't spend it all on care, but I needed this money for over here, so I spent it over here. That's how we've gotten into the muck we're in now. We can't allow that drifting and shifting to happen, because we can see the pattern very clearly of what happens when we allow that. We need to make revenues and expenditures for publicly funded care homes available to the public. People are entitled to know how their money is spent and to access financial information about each facility. The accuracy and transparency of compliance with funded care hours. So right now, we know what the facility reports to us that they have delivered in terms of funded care hours. What the current reporting system is not able to detect is if there is a drift of some staff, we call them multi-skilled workers, who are delivering direct care and indirect care. So they might be doing some care aid work in the morning, and they might be doing food services work over lunch, and they might be doing housekeeping work in the afternoon. The system is not very good at being able to detect if we are inadvertently capturing some of those non-care hours delivered by that person in our direct care hours. And I think a better way to do that would happen certainly if we embedded care hours into regulations. And then we need to define profit. What's going to be counted as profit? We need to sort out these head office allocations, these management fees, these capital costs like mortgages, these executive compensation. It all needs to get sorted out so that everybody is very, very clear when you see the bottom line that says profit. What are the common expenses that have been deducted, and ensuring that they aren't also another form of profit, which to some extent is happening in some of our facilities today. The degree to which it is and the amounts unclear, because we don't have the clarity and breakdown of those expenditures. And so if we are able to achieve this, we will move to a system where the public can have confidence that the money it's investing in long-term care, which will soon be over $2 billion a year, is being spent in a way that is recognizing our number one concern is the care and comfort of the resident, and that we want good value for our money, and that public money, when it is spent in the private sector, should be done so in a way that is equitable, that is fair, and that is transparent. And we can achieve that, and I hope that we will, and everybody will benefit when we're able to do that. So that concludes my presentation today, and I'm happy to take any questions.
A reminder to reporters on the line, please press *1 to enter the queue. You'll be limited to one question and one follow-up. We'll start in the room. Our first question today comes from Katie DeRosa from the Vancouver Sun.
$1,000 a month. That's somebody who is in a private care home that has no public subsidy. So the basic way it sorts out there is the for-profit care providers are either providing subsidized care, and they've got some of these co-located private pay beds. Those people are doing this all-inclusive payment. So let's say it's $7,500 a month, and it's, you get all these things for $7,500 a month. The for-profit care homes who only have for-profit beds, they're the ones that generally use a more a la carte approach. That's where you can see costs going up to $15,000 or $20,000 a month, because if you need care, if you come in and you only need care in the morning, well, that's only going to cost you $20 a day. Oh, now you need care in the evening, that's another $20. That's generally that approach. And in the private sector, the person or their family who's paying that $20,000 generally gets to see exactly what they're paying for, and they can question what they're not. The issue here is that you've got most of the for-profit care homes in British Columbia have mostly public subsidized beds. They're getting the money from the government and the resident copay, but it's all sort of mixed together. And they say we're providing, this many hours of care and doing all of this. And that's where the challenge is. It's very clear when you look every year, you will see the pattern where for-profits are not delivering the funded hours they're funded to deliver. The not-for-profits are, and then some. Everybody's in the same labor pool. So these issues about, we can't get the staff, so we couldn't hire. Well, the not-for-profits are in the same labor market that the for-profits are. So how come? When you have to make a decision, you're short-staffed on the unit, am I going to pay overtime for somebody, or am I going to be short-staffed? Well, overtime costs money, more money than I might be funded to deliver that hour of care. So when it's my money, maybe I'm going to make the decision to go short, versus in the not-for-profit, they're making the decision to pay the overtime, never a good thing, but compared to the resident getting no help, it's better than nothing.
So again, if the government wants to be responsible with public funds, basically what you're saying is that it should force the private care homes to provide all their funding figures publicly so that it can keep them accountable. And is that something you've obviously given these recommendations to the government? Is that something they seem amenable to do?
They absolutely are. In fact, I think they will say, we will hear from health authorities, if they don't provide the hours of care, we claw the money back. No. If you did, these numbers would look different, right? I think the degree to which there are some extremely uncomfortable conversations, and I think I've said this before, is underestimated. On the one hand, it always sounds good. We have to consult with everybody, and I think most people have heard my frustration before. We're not partners in the delivery of this care. This is not an equal relationship. Government is the regulator and the funder. We have a responsibility to the people who live there, and we have a responsibility to the taxpayers. Those are our primary responsibilities. And we need to understand that in order to make this equitable, somebody or a group of people are going to make a lot less money than they've been making. So to feel that consulting them in the process is important, and how I think we're underestimating and being maybe a bit naive about how a bunch of people have no interest in changing this funding formula. And, just think about if you're in an office with a whole bunch of different kinds of people, and somebody comes in and says, okay, everybody in the office is going to earn the same salary. Well, some people's salary is going to go up and some people's salary is going to go down if you're spending the same amount of money, right? And that's what we're dealing with here. And I think there's just I don't know if reluctance is the right word. It's taking, I think, a very, very long time to wrestle with this issue. And yes, we had COVID, and yes, we needed to get this wage leveling out there, but we are continuing to provide wage leveling to private for-profit care homes so that they'll pay the wages we've already funded them to pay, right? So when we did the review 5 years ago, the big revelation was we're paying care homes, we're funding them at $40 an hour for their care aides. They're only paying them $30 an hour, and they can keep the $10 difference. Oh, well, that's not, okay. Along comes COVID. We said, okay, all the people are now, if you're not getting paid what you should, we're going to give the operator the wage leveling to pay up, except we'd already paid them. But we had to move quickly. And we have continued that payment. It continues to this day, this wage leveling. And it's reflected in the profits. I mean, it's sort of counterintuitive that over the last 5 years, during COVID, publicly subsidized long-term care delivered by the private sector, its profits went up 113%.
Next, we'll go to the phones. We have a question from Justine Hunter from the Globe and Mail.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. The most shocking statistic, I think, in this report is the shortfall of hours for direct care in some of the for-profit facilities. But you also said most facilities are now meeting the minimum. So I'm just wondering, can you give us a sense of the range of inequity? Because it looks like some places are going to be far worse than just being a little bit below the required hours.
I want to clarify when I said meeting the minimum. That's for being funded for the care hours. That's not the same as delivering them, Justine. So we know, and my office reports on, how many funded hours of care each facility receives from the health authority. That's where we've gotten to basically almost everybody at 3.36. Whether they're delivering those hours or not is a different issue and is not reported on on an annual basis, or with sort of a great amount of transparency. So to go back to, the order of magnitude of these 500,000 hours less than what have been funded, the context is 500,000 hours out of 12 million hours. So on a facility by facility basis, the dramatic, are you going in there and there's, instead of 3.36, it's only 1.1? No, you're not likely seeing it. It will be subtle, but it is a persistent and consistent pattern. That's what I think we have to recognize. That whatever year we look at, we can look at, 21, 22, we can look at 2021, 19, 20, whatever you look. It is this significant under-delivery of hours by the for-profits and over-delivery by the not-for-profits. And it's little by the, to give you an order of magnitude, I think 500,000 hours, if you multiply it by 3.36, I can't remember, it's hundreds and hundreds of care beds it would staff each year with those care hours. So it is significant overall. And I think what is the word I'm looking for? A sort of a harbinger of what might come if we don't get this issue wrestled to the ground.
Did you have a follow-up?
I do. Thank you. Federal government is planning to table the Safe Long-Term Care Act, maybe this fall, I don't know, to establish those national standards in the sector. And I'm wondering, given we don't have consistency here, even in this province, between health authorities, do we need enforceable national standards, do you think?
What I think we need is we need to embed the care hours in the regulations in BC. So the Safe Long-Term Care Act is going to be federal, and the delivery of long-term care is a provincial responsibility. So it remains to be seen the degree to which it's going to be a fundamental shift, the degree to which it's going to recommend 4 hours of care a day or state that is expected. But regardless of whether it's 3.36 or it's 4.0, it's not in regulation right now. If you look at childcare, for example, same licensing officers that go into long-term care go into daycares. We have embedded in the regulations the staffing ratio. So when you go into a daycare, depending on the age of the children, you might need 10 children for every one ECE. We don't have that yet in long-term care. And I think if we shifted to that, it would help address some of this.
Funded?
That's not a term I use, Lisa. I think what the report shows is that based on relatively, we're giving money to the for-profit sector and we're giving money to the not-for-profit sector, and the not-for-profit sector is giving us more care hours than we're funding them to deliver, and the for-profit sector is giving us less care hours than we're funding them to deliver. And so people will draw their own conclusions from those facts.
Did you have a follow-up, Lisa?
Yes, I just was wondering if you could talk a little bit. You mentioned that there's a need for a better definition of the term profit. And so I wonder if you could just clarify that a bit or give a bit more detail to that.
I think when you start mucking through all these statements, as I've done, and your eyes can glaze over a bit, but what becomes clear, we talk about the bite at the profit apple, if you will. So all of these profits that we are reporting, first of all, they're what the facility itself has declared as their profit. And it's after absolutely every expense has been taken off. So it's reasonable to say, okay, how do we know if a facility is contracting for its care and the company it's contracting for is a related company? And that company makes a profit. So it's getting some profit over here as well as profit in its own facility. The management fees. Management fees are generally found in facilities where they are one of a number of facilities in a company. And so how do we know when the management fees aren't another way of accruing profit? They're going somewhere to somebody for something. And is that producing profit somewhere else? Even the mortgaging. So, how do we know that a facility, when we're paying the mortgage, it's because it's a brand new facility and it built and we've got to, pay the per square foot cost and that's what it is, versus an older facility that has chosen to take out some of its capital for its own use through a mortgage, and then we pay the mortgage. So it's a very, I think the best way to describe it is that the profit that's currently reported is minimal in terms of, it's not that there's a lot less profit out there because, there's all these other expenses. There's more, we just don't know how much more and where it is.
Next we have Wolf Deppner, Black Press.
Yes, thank you for taking my question. So just to make sure I heard you correctly, essentially what you're arguing is that the current system rewards for-profit operators for delivering less care at a higher cost for taxpayers than non-for-profits who are delivering more care at a lower cost. Is there any way to quantify the difference in terms of taxpayers' money lost?
That's a good question. There would be a way, I think. You could calculate, you could take the 500, I don't have my calculator at my fingertips, but you would take your 500,000 hours and you would multiply it by our blended cost per hour worked, which I think is, if my memory serves me correctly, somewhere around $40 an hour or $50 an hour. It's in the report. And so if it's 40, what's that? 20 million, I think. I need a calculator. Sometimes my decimal points, but that's how you would do it. You would take the 500,000 hours. You would multiply it by the average cost per hour worked in direct care. That would tell you how much you've shorted in the for-profit sector. Then you would take the 93 million, multiply it by the same cost per hour worked blended rate for the not-for-profit sector. That's how much over they've delivered. You'd add that to the money in the for-profit sector, and that would give you what you're looking for if you caught all that.
Do you have a follow-up?
Yes, I do. Thank you. So obviously you talked about the need for greater government regulation, but that's in the future. What, if any, way is there for government to recover some of the money that you just showed that these operators essentially owe the public?
Ask for it back would be the way to recover it.
Thank you, everyone. That concludes today's event.
Thank you.